Often called Africa's undoing, the Berlin Conference saw the powers of Europe divide the African continent like young boys dividing up baseball cards. With little to no concern for the culture of the continent, maps were redrawn and lands were claimed. As Europe bickered over who got what, the native inhabitants of Africa watched as their culture was uprooted and destroyed. Before we dive into the details of the conference, let's take a look at the years leading up to it. When Henry Morton Stanley explored the Congo region, Europe's interest in the continent swelled. In the 1870s, organizations like the International African Society and the International Congo Society were formed by Europeans to research and civilize the continent. Of course, it didn't take long for researching and civilizing to turn into claiming and conquering as countries like France, Britain, Germany, Belgium, and Portugal scrambled to grab up new lands. This scramble of sorts was the impetus for the mid-1880s Berlin Conference, where over a dozen European countries met to discuss the colonization of Africa. In order to grasp the impact of this conference, we need to understand that prior to the conference, a large majority of Africa was still under local control. In other words, the native inhabitants of Africa were still ruling their own people groups. Also at the time of the conference, European colonization had focused mainly on the coast of the continent. Africa's interior remained virtually untouched by outsiders. Ignoring ancient cultural lines and people groups, the participants of the Berlin Conference spent about 3 months devising guidelines for colonization of not just Africa's coast, but the interior as well. To make trade easier for everyone, the conference decided the Congo and Niger rivers would remain neutral and open. Beyond this, the conference declared Europeans were free to aggressively colonize Africa. Making matters even worse for the Africans, it also established the principle of effectivity, which made it acceptable for one European nation to claim jump another European nation's African claims if they were not fully exploiting the land. In other words, the Berlin Conference pretty much told Europe they couldn't establish a continent in name only. They had to use it or lose it. As you can imagine, this allowed abuses to abound across the continent. In fact, within years of the conference, it's estimated that over half of the Congo Basin's native population had died. The year following the conference held further chaos for the continent and its people. By the early 20th century, Europe had cut Africa up into dozens of new countries. Great Britain held places like Uganda, Kenya, South Africa, Egypt, the Sudan, Zambia, Zimbabwe, and more, while France controlled much of Western Africa. Belgium controlled the Congo, and Germany took places like Tanzania and Namibia. Not to be left out, the Portuguese, the Italians, and the Spanish also got their share. Sadly, the boundaries of all of these new countries held little respect for the culture or the long-established boundaries of the native people groups. After Henry Morton Stanley's exploration of the Congo, Europe's interest in the African continent soared to new heights. Soon, most of the European powers were scrambling to lay a claim on the continent. In order to establish some sort of order amid this scramble, the Berlin Conference convened in the mid-1880s to create guidelines for the division of Africa. As over a dozen European powers met, it was decided that the Congo and Niger rivers would remain free to all European trade. Being especially devastating to the native populations, the principle of effectivity was also established. This made it acceptable for one European nation to claim jump another European nation's African claims if they were not fully exploiting the land. Taking this principle to heart, the years following the conference saw the European nations of Britain, France, Belgium, Germany, and many others swallow up the native cultures of the continent. As Europe profited from the continent, the people groups of Africa paid the price. And although today's Africa is officially free, it still carries the lasting debt of the Berlin Conference.